This is the Convict Australia podcast. Thank you for tuning in. What to do with reoffending convicts had always been a topic of hot debate. Punish them with physical pain, such as flogging and irons? Deprive them of everything in a solitary confinement cell? Or perhaps banish them from society again? In the early 1800s, the government was so exasperated with the burden of convicts, they were open to hear any suggestions on the subject. In fact, Captain Maconochie was commissioned by the Prison Disciplinary Society to give his thoughts on reoffending convicts. Maconochie was the Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land. He had long given the subject thought and eagerly wrote his report, which was sent to the Colonial Office in October 1837. His ideas were to become known as the mark system. The mark system was a currency in which the criminal repaid his debt in marks, and the size of the debt was dependent on the severity of the crime. The criminal could earn marks with good behaviour and task work. Maconochie wanted fixed-term sentences abolished in replacement of this system. A criminal, according to Maconochie, was a, quote, debtor required to be imprisoned or otherwise detained till his debt is paid, end quote. He believed this gave the convict a purpose in life that would continue after the debt was repaid. Instead of physical punishments, such as flogging and irons, the convict would lose marks. Convicts were incentivised to earn marks and could use them to obtain better food and luxuries, though this wouldn't help them save enough marks to achieve their freedom. Maconochie believed this system would teach them the economics of looking after themselves in the real world. There were many stages to the mark system. The first was a short stage of hard labour with moral, religious and practical guidance. The next was working in small teams where everyone had their marks put into a collective pot. If one person lost marks for bad behaviour, the whole team lost marks. Quote, good conduct popular and misconduct unpopular in the community, each affecting others as well as the individual actor, end quote. He believed this created a sense of social consciousness and community. Officials were so intrigued by his report, he was given the go-ahead to introduce it to Norfolk Island from 1840. From 1825, Norfolk Island had been a dumping ground for convicts who were considered the hardest reoffending criminals in the colony. Before Maconochie arrived, the convicts had been treated with such brutality it was almost considered inhumane even by the day's standards. From 1840, with the end of transportation to New South Wales, Norfolk Island's hotbed of notorious criminals had been diluted with fresh first-time offenders that were sent straight to the island from England. Maconochie was given instruction to keep these newbies away from old hands for fear of them being corrupted, but within a week he realised that, given the small size of the island, this would be impossible and abandoned the request. Some of the luxuries that Maconochie introduced were a library and musical instruments. Maconochie also gave deserving convicts cooking pots and utensils to cook their own food. He also allocated them small plots of land in which to cultivate their own vegetables to supplement their limited and dull rations. They were encouraged to rear livestock and grow tobacco and could trade these items. He shortened their workday and gave holidays for good behaviour. On Queen Victoria's birthday, the convicts were treated to a day off and enjoyed the festivities such as team games and watched a theatre production put on by a group of convicts. They enjoyed fresh meat and drank rum. Unfortunately, Maconochie's festivities were mocked by the colonial press, who seemed to have it in for him, and the powers that be considered the mark system to be a failure. He was replaced by Major Childs in February 1844. Major Childs was a military man who had a reputation as being a strict disciplinarian. Once Major Childs was installed in Norfolk Island, he began stripping the convicts of the luxuries they had worked earnestly for. Over the next 2 years, work hours were lengthened, rations were reduced, and brutal punishments such as flogging were regularly handed down. They also lost their garden plots that they had worked so hard to cultivate. With each privilege that was ripped away from them, the convicts grew more and more resentful and bitter. Most of the convicts already despised authority, but this just escalated their hatred. Their anger began brewing and fermenting like a pustulous boil waiting to erupt. When the convicts awoke on the morning of the 1st of July, 1846, they discovered that their cooking utensils had been confiscated during the night, and when they demanded to know where they were informed that they wouldn't be needing them any longer, as they were no longer free to cook for themselves. This was the final straw. It was a convict by the name of William Westwood that took the lead. Westwood was better known as Jackey Jackey, the gentleman bushranger, a notorious reoffender. He had originally been sentenced for 14 years transportation for stealing a coat. Once he was in the colony, he was assigned to an overseer in Bungendore that treated him badly by not giving him enough food to eat and not supplying him with clothing. This led Westwood to steal wheat. He was caught, imprisoned, and returned to the overseer. Westwood escaped and roamed the southern district, stealing all that he needed to survive in the bush: horses, clothes, food, arms, and money. He was known as the gentleman bushranger, as he never harmed his victims, and he was courteous with women. But after years of brutal treatment and this last semblance of human decency being denied them, something just snapped inside of Westwood. He turned to his fellow prisoner, Lawrence Kavanagh, another renowned bushranger, and together they led a group of angry men to rush the stores to reclaim their cooking utensils. With anger still coursing through their bodies, they charged towards the constable's barracks. They broke into the barracks, smashing windows and severely beating any officers they came across. They seized the officers' cooking pots and pans, bashing them around until they were destroyed. The riot was now in full swing and growing in numbers and strength. The prisoners returned to the mess room and killed a gatekeeper named John Morris before storming the cookhouse and brutally slaughtering an officer named Stephen Smith. The group was out of control and they intended to kill every free person on the island. They continued on their murderous rampage, heading to the lime kiln hut where 3 constables lay sleeping in their beds after working on night duty. 2 of the constables received fatal blows to the head with an axe, but the third, Michael Ryan, awoke to the noise and managed to escape outside, but was met by Westwood, who nearly bludgeoned him to death. Another prisoner managed to talk Westwood down and saved Ryan from a terrible death. Ryan was left critically injured. By this time, the military had been notified of the riot and were hot on their heels. To the relief of the free settlers, the military were quickly able to surround the prisoners. Around 1,100 prisoners were secured in the yard. Each prisoner was inspected, and any showing splatters of blood on them were placed to one side and secured in irons and were locked in various government buildings around the island. Westwood walked up to the major. His face, hands and shirt were covered in blood and said, quote, "I suppose it's me you want," end quote. He and Kavanagh were taken to the boathouse where they were shackled to a cable. Knowing they would all be hanged for their actions, numerous escapes were attempted, with 6 men nearly succeeding. They had somehow obtained a chisel, a notched knife, and a file, and set to work trying to free themselves from their handcuffs. To cover the sound, they sang a favourite song that went, quote, "Merry row, my bonny, bonny bark, bring back my love to calm my woe before the night grows dark." End quote. The prisoners did manage to free themselves of their handcuffs, but they were caught when a fellow prisoner betrayed them. This led to the guard being doubled. Another group of prisoners continued their assault by tossing stones at the guards, which led to the guards firing at them, with 2 being seriously wounded. The gruesome, bloody attack shook every free settler on the island, particularly the women, and it wasn't long before many of them had packed up all their belongings and were boarding the next ship off the island. Several government men also resigned their positions and left the island feeling that they were doomed if they stayed. So great was the hatred felt by the prisoners. On the 13th of October, 12 men were brought to the scaffold. They had been sentenced to death for their murderous rampage. 2 other men had been lucky enough to be acquitted. Westwood, Henry Whiting, and William Pickthorne received counsel by the Reverend Mr. Rogers. The other 9 men, who were of the Roman Catholic faith, were attended by Reverends Murray and Bond. In his last moments, Westwood made a desperate plea to Reverend Rogers, saying, quote, "I wish to say, as a dying man, that I believe 4 men now going to suffer are innocent of the crime now laid to their charge. Lawrence Kavanagh, Henry Whiting, William Pickthorne, and William Scrimshaw, and declare that I never spoke to Kavanagh on the morning of the riots, and these other 3 men had no part in the killing of John Morris, as far as I know of." End quote. 2 of those 3 men swore they were innocent, but it fell on deaf ears. Westwood didn't deny his involvement in the crimes. As his last act before the noose was tightened around his neck, Westwood placed a written history of his life into the hands of Reverend Rogers. Westwood was only 26 years old at the time of his execution. Well, that was the story of the cooking pot riot. I really think that if these convict men were treated better, this riot would never have happened, and there would not have been such a huge loss of life. When I was researching this story, I read that a collection was made for the family of Stephen Smith, who left behind a wife and 3 small children. By August, £100 had been raised for them. I have several photos that go with this episode that I will put on the Convict Australia Instagram page. One of the pictures is a photo of Westwood's death mask. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a positive review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're watching this episode on YouTube, please hit the like button. These little gestures make such a big difference in the podcasting world. Thank you for your support. Thank you for listening to the Convict Australia podcast. If you'd like to show your appreciation and get more involved, there are a number of ways you can. The first is by signing up to Convict Australia on Patreon, and you will get some perks like the Convict Australia Newsletter. Secondly, leave a review and tell your friends and family. This really does make a huge difference. And lastly, join the Facebook and Instagram group Convict Australia. All the links I've mentioned will be in the show notes. Thank you again. Till next time.